Hey guys, how's it going? So I figured I'd kind of appear on your notes today. So maybe it's a little bit more normal that you can have me actually explaining what we're doing. So our lesson today is about the types of economies that have developed throughout the world. There's four main types, and I'll go over each one. But I wanted to start with what is an economic system in the first place. Basically, an economic system is the way that a country deals with the fact that they have more people than they have resources, whether that be like time to help people, giving, welfare money if that's necessary, healthcare, education, all of those things. So it's basically how deciding how those scarce resources should be distributed or given out to citizens in their country or society. And this can happen countrywide, statewide, citywide, whatever. It happens at all levels. But we're going to talk about the four main types of economies that have developed over like countries instead of just small communities. So the first one here is traditional economy. We'll go over what each of these are in detail, but it is very much what it sounds like. So basically, you follow traditions in that economy. Based on what your ancestors did. So, command economy, again, sounds very like what it is. The government sort of commands you to do certain things at certain times and tells you kind of what your life is going to be like. And then market economy is again kind of what it sounds like. So the market is actually determined by what people want, so supply and demand and how it all works together. And then a mixed economy is kind of borrows some traditions from each one of these. So starting with traditional economic systems. And my little Bitmojis here will make sense as we go through this. But basically, it's an economic system that's largely based off of like customs, traditions, hence the name, religion sometimes. Sometimes religious traditions play a big role in what these economic systems have become. Characteristics as far as what a traditional economy is, it's basically like an economic system that develops in usually a smaller society. This is usually in smaller groups, not necessarily a whole country, where they have longstanding traditions, longstanding beliefs, religious beliefs sometimes that determine who gets what resources, who does what jobs. Like if your father was a priest, you'll probably also be a priest. If your father was a blacksmith or a miner, okay, or a baker, you will probably be the same thing. Or your mother, whoever. They're usually inherited from one generation down to the next. So, since I'm a teacher and my husband's a mechanic, my son should be either a teacher or a mechanic, right? So, it centers around the family unit or like a tribe or a clan, whatever you want to call it. And like I said, usually it's inherited through your family line. So, it depends on what size economic system it is, but basically if your family kind of works together as a unit, you try and provide resources for each other based on who's in your family. And it's usually like an extended family, not just your mom, your dad, your brother and sister. It's usually like grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, and you kind of all do different jobs in order to help each other out. It's usually hunter-gatherer societies that aren't really like developed yet. So usually you don't find traditional economies very often anymore unless it's in very rural areas, such as I know of a few tribes that still operate on this in the Amazon or in sub-Saharan Africa. In areas like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there are still tribal nations that operate on this system. But obviously in America, we don't do that anymore. So there are some pros and cons. Pros are that skills are definitely not lost because they're kind of passed down from parent to child over and over again. There's usually not a lot of conflict between citizens because people understand that you have to work together in order for everyone to survive. So there's less conflict and less competition over things. And it's definitely more sustainable or eco-friendly, green, whatever you want to call it, because people are usually not in a developed area and they understand that they have to live off of the land and what that provides for them. The cons, obviously, you don't have as much choice in your job. Like if Turner didn't want to be a mechanic or a teacher and he, wants to be a doctor or whatever he wants to be. Garbage man, he loves the garbage truck right now. That's his favorite thing in the whole world. So if he wanted to be a garbage man instead, he wouldn't necessarily have that option. It depends heavily on the ability to find natural resources too. So if that society's been in that area for a very long time and maybe like chopped all the trees down before new trees were able to grow, that would be a serious issue because they don't have any other resources to draw from. A real world example, obviously, we have like ancient societies, we have tribal societies that still live in very rural areas in Africa and South America, like I referenced. Some traditional Native American societies. There are several reservations where people still choose to live in the old ways of their Native American tribe. So those would all be examples in our world, like today. Our next one, second one. So command economic systems. So the name of the game is you got it, boss, and the government is your boss. Okay. So it's basically an economic system where the government controls what's produced, when it's produced, who gets it, who's producing it, what your job is. All of those things are dictated to you. And it usually is a dictatorship. Government basically has total control over everything, over how much income you get, what kind of job you're allowed to have, what kind of jobs you're not allowed to have, what level of education you receive in order to do that job, things like that. So obviously the cons there, you don't have any choice. There are a lot of wasted products because it's not based on supply and demand. If it's something that the country says, oh yeah, people are going to need a lot of this, but people actually don't want it because it either doesn't work or doesn't fit their taste. There are a lot of wasted products that happen in command economies. There's not a lot of variety of goods because they're usually more isolated. So they aren't trading a lot with other countries, which tends to lead to a lower quality of life. Like here in America, we can buy almost anything because we have globalized trade. But there are some pros. If you want to think about it that way, you're not forcing businesses out with competition because the main businesses are government controlled. So there's not a lot of like, oh, that company went out of business because the big company took over. And you can mobilize a lot of products quickly. So if the government is the one controlling what's produced, when it's produced, where it's produced, and suddenly, for example, in this pandemic situation, you say, okay, we need a lot of masks and gloves and stuff like that. You can change all the businesses that you currently own as the government to be making masks and gloves, right? Very quickly. You don't have to ask companies if they're willing to do that because they're privately owned. You get to decide that. So that is a pro. A real world example would be North Korea today. There are lots of dictatorships, but that's usually the one most people know about. Russia used to be a command economy and still in some ways is. China is a command economy as well. So those are some good real world examples. Market economic systems are the exact opposite. Okay. It's basically a system where what's produced and what prices everything is, how much of everything is produced is purely based on competition, based on supply and demand, based on what people want. And the government really tries not to be very involved in economic choices. So basically, like I said, the market is regulated by how much supply of something there is and how much people want of that product. So if there's a high demand, usually there will be a high supply that tries to keep up with it. But if the supply gets too high, higher than the demand, then you have issues where, oh, you better drop your price because people don't want it as much. So prices will fluctuate over time based on supply and demand. And we'll go more into that later. But the government doesn't own a lot of businesses, does not influence what is produced, when it's produced, or who gets those goods and services. You have to buy them yourself. So that is kind of a con. There's no like price fixing that keeps things really affordable for people. And there's no minimum income that's guaranteed except for, minimum wage, but you have to have a job in order to get minimum wage, right? And then in that system, what kind of tends to naturally happen is that people that already had a lot of money are able to make money more quickly, whereas people that don't have a lot of money from the start, it's very difficult to get more because you have to have a lot of capital in order to own a business to make more capital. And there's obviously people that don't fit that norm. But on the whole, that's kind of how market economies work. There are a lot of monopoly situations like Amazon, right? So Amazon is a huge monopoly as far as being able to buy cheap products online and get them shipped to you for free. I don't know of any other company that can do as many products as quickly as Amazon can. And I'm definitely not a victim. I actively choose to shop on Amazon all the time. And it's been my best friend lately because we can't really go anywhere. But there is kind of a monopoly situation. So if they did choose to suddenly raise their prices, there wouldn't be a whole lot people could do about it because we all depend on Amazon a lot. But anyway, so there are some pros though, obviously too. People get the goods that they want, right? So because if there's demand for something, somebody's going to produce it so that they can make some money. You have a lot more variety of goods to choose from. People can find their own path, and like being innovative and starting your own business, being an entrepreneur, someone who's really driven, is pretty rewarded in this system versus other systems. Because if you can be innovative and if you can produce things faster and better than other people, you will be the one making the money off of those products or services. Obviously, the United States is a good example of this. There is some government involvement. There has to be some government involvement somewhere to make sure that companies don't do illegal, bad things that are horrible to people. But for the most part, our country tries to stay out of the economy. So what ends up happening is you have countries that are going, traditional doesn't work for us because we're developed. I don't want to be command because I want people to be able to make their own businesses and their own choices. But market is too free, and that freaks me out. So they have kind of this middle ground that's called a mixed economic system. So basically, the government owns certain key industries like healthcare or education or whatever, and provides those as services to its people. But everything else is determined by supply and demand. Okay, so it's kind of like supply and demand market, but the government has more involvement and owns certain industries in order to give people, hey, I really need some money. I've fallen on hard times. I lost my job. Government goes, okay, here you go. We'll help you out until you can get a new job or whatever. Excuse me. So usually they're described as like socialist countries with a goal of keeping prices lower on certain like staple things like healthcare, education, housing, things like that, so that most of their citizens can afford them. Taxes usually are higher in those countries, but they do usually there's a trade-off of, yes, you have higher taxes, but you also, those cover your like minimum income or your minimum health care or your minimum education or whatever. The government does still allow for competition, free enterprise and stuff like that with other industries. Like, if you wanted to start your own spa or something, they wouldn't own all of the spa industry. You could do that. But if you wanted to start your own school, it would have to be privatized and you wouldn't be part of like the government's education program. Pros and cons. So pros gives a basic quality of life to most, almost all of its citizens, and encourages people to innovate and be, competitive in a market that isn't owned by the government. It is a little bit more, it's a little bit easier to predict that type of economy and how it's going to kind of go up and down as it, goes through the business cycle, which again, we'll talk about later. But it is a little bit easier to predict kind of what's going to happen with a mixed economy. The cons is government systems are not always all that efficient because they're so large. So sometimes like the healthcare or the education in those systems are not perfect, and they do struggle not being as productive as a company that maybe is owned by a private citizen. Usually can create some debt that the taxes don't cover. How much is needed for people's healthcare or people's education or minimum income or whatever. And there is a little bit less competition in those big industries then, because the government does control that. So the best examples I can give you of those are any countries that are in the European Union right now, Great Britain, Ireland, France, all of those countries. Canada, to an extent, has a mixed economy as well. So those are kind of our real world examples. I did just want to include this too, just so you guys understand. I call the United States a market economy. However, if you're talking about economists thinking this is a pure command economy or a pure market economy where the government has zero input, no countries exist like that. And no countries exist where every single tiny little decision is made by the government. It's just not possible. But North Korea is probably the closest to a pure command economy, and the US is the closest to a market economy, where you kind of have like Mexico and Canada, Sweden, Great Britain, kind of in this area. Russia and China are more towards like the command spectrum. So always think of economic systems on a spectrum. It's not definitively one thing or another. We kind of just match it with what works closest to that. Okay. All right. Well, hopefully I wasn't too long-winded for you. I tried to keep it as simple and to the point as I possibly can. And hopefully this helps that you can actually see me and hear me explaining this to you. So just let me know on Google Classroom how you feel about today's lesson. Don't forget to take some notes. And I will see you guys on Wednesday. All right. Have a good one.